Hello, we are back for some theater history and looking at the Italian Renaissance. First, I'd like to apologize for my stuffy nose and scratchy voice in this video, but hopefully the information will still come across for you. So, remember where we were coming from. We were in the Middle Ages, we had religious theater. The religious theater gave way to secular theater. The church got angry about secular theater and blamed it for immorality. And then eventually, with the Protestant Reformation, religious theater was banned. And so we went into the Dark Age. So we went from the Dark Ages to the Middle Ages, and now we start to see a flourishing of art come about during the Renaissance. So this period is approximately 1400 to 1650. Now, we separate the Italian Renaissance from the English Renaissance because there were different things going on in different parts of Europe at this time. So here in Italy, we see Renaissance art like Michelangelo and Da Vinci. There's this focus on humanism, a focus on people rather than gods. So where before, even through the Greeks and the Romans in the Middle Ages, a lot of the theater had religious themes. And here we begin to really explore what it means to be human and those emotions and those trials and those tribulations. Also going on, if you look at the time, 1400s, there's exploration of the new world. The idea that, you know, things are not as they had originally seemed. And we also have, in science, we have our astronomer Galileo. And hopefully, if you've learned about this in history or science classes, you can kind of tie what you've learned in those classes to what you're learning here in theater history. I'll be honest, I didn't have good history teachers growing up. I didn't understand the timeline of the way things progressed. And I only learned it when I actually learned theater history and how theater was impacted by what was going on in the world around it. So Italian drama, not really known for great playwriting. And we know that the Romans were not really known for a great high art either. Middle Ages were some really good writings, definitely religious based, and then you went into those folk tales. So here in Italian drama, we're not seeing the best playwriting that we can. They had tragedies and comedies, and these were revivals of the teaching of the Greek plays. So we're moving into a time coming out of the Middle Ages where we start to see universities popping up and this concentration on intellect and philosophy. So people were reading the work of the Greeks. In around 1453, there was a transfer of Greek and Roman manuscripts into Italian. So we now have these stories being translated to different languages. And we also had the publication of Greek and Roman plays because of Gutenberg's printing press. So where we weren't able to duplicate these, now we can, and these plays are being shared in the universities and being read and studied by people. Two Italian dramas of this time were the Intermezzi and the Pastorals. So the Intermezzi, if you look at the name, Intermezzi sounds very much like intermission. These were short pieces that depicted mythological tales, and they're usually presented between acts of full-length plays. Required spectacular scenic events, and they were really popular in the 1500s, but unfortunately disappeared by the 1600s. So while they were a piece of art during this time, they weren't necessarily a lasting art that stuck around. Pastoral, sounding like pasture, these were modeled after the Greek satyr plays, which were these short comic pieces that were a follow-up to tragedies. A lot of the time, the subject matter was romance. characters were usually shepherds and mythological creatures who inhabit the forest and the countryside, and there were these lovers who faced odds and then are reunited. Again, we see these, but we're not really performing this style today. Um, some things I'm sure you could compare to them, but not necessarily something that we see as standalone pieces of theater. The opera, however, is the only theatrical form of the Italian Renaissance to survive and actually be um, still performed well today. It was born from the Greek influence because we remember that the Greeks oftentimes sung some of theirs, like the dithyramb. They usually had live musicians. The choruses would dance and do these spectacles. So it was kind of born from the Greek influence of fusing music and drama together. Most operas are completely sung and sung in Italian in this case, but there are operas in other languages as well. This opera at this time actually becomes the springboard for what would eventually become the contemporary American and British musicals that are characterized as operas. So we have the modern American musical, and we have these modern musical operas such as Sweeney Todd or Jesus Christ Superstar, Vita, Phantom of the Opera. One of the other forms that, while not necessarily a lasting art, this is still an art that is studied and forms of it are used still today. This is called Commedia dell'Arte. I love saying that. Commedia dell'Arte. Um, these were considered or translated to the play of professional artists. So from around 1550 to 1750, you had Commedia dell'Arte performed by professionals. Media companies consisted of 10 performers, 7 men, and woohoo, 3 females. Um, and we knew that there were some females performing, but again, not very widely spread at this point. Actors played the same stock characters, so you would have these stock characters um, in every scene, in every play, and they would wear these masks that kind of identified who their character who their character was. Except for the lovers. The lovers were the only ones who didn't wear masks. They wore makeup. Originally, Commedia dell'Arte were improvised presentations using scenarios. So they would have these short scripts without dialogue that provided the plot outline. So in it, you would know this, and this are to happen in this order. But then everything else was made up in between. Great improvisation. And we see improvisation kind of modeled after this a lot because it's very risky to do a full-on improv. So a lot of companies that perform in improv troupes, they have these characters that they keep digging up and bringing to the table. They have these little scenarios that they know will go over well with the audience. They can always bring up. About 1,000 scenarios survived, and you can actually look these up online and look up Commedia dell'Arte scenarios and find them, and you'll see the characters and the storyline, and then you just go at it. And I did this a couple years ago, either last year and several years ago, where I gave each group a scenario, and then they had to finish acting it out. Some of these Commedia dell'Arte characters were Pantalone. He's the lecherous old miser, Venetian. Torre, who's a foolish pedant involved in neighbors' affairs. Capitano, the cowardly braggart soldier. Zanni, foolish or sly servant who usually gets in trouble and mixes everything up and is the cause of all the strife. Young lovers. And Lazzi is a repeated physical bit. So where we call something slapstick, if you look at the term below, slapstick, Slapstick comedy is often used with physical humor, like slipping on the banana peel, or walking into a pole, or poking somebody between the eyes, smacking them in the back of the head, tripping them, all that kind of physical comedy we call slapstick. But actually, the terminology comes from the word lazy, which were these repeated physical bits like the Marx Brothers, Laurel and Hardy, the Three Stooges. And slapstick was actually a stick used for the costume they would slap people with. So here's some imagery, and you can see how we are evolving from the Greeks, the Romans, Middle Ages, now these Italian outfits. One of the biggest things that we get from the Italian Renaissance, thanks to the Italians, we get our theater building structures. We had, again, if you're looking at the progression, Greeks built into the landscape, Romans built straight up. It's still those arena type. The Middle Ages, you had your stationary platforms or your processional pageant wagons. And then here, we actually have a theater building. The Italian Renaissance architects revolutionized theater construction. The proscenium arch stage, which is like most stages used today, including our PAC, that proscenium separates the audience from the theater action on stage. You also have audience seating all of a sudden, so you have the pit and the boxes and the galleries. You have a groove system, which is this system where you can move scenery on and off. And then you have the pole and chariot system. The glories, we're using a fly machine, so now we've got flies, we've got trapdoors, we have sound effects, and we have lighting. Granted, not electric, but we use candles. And there were a lot of theater fires because of this. Here's an example of how scenery would have moved, and you can see the stage there. I can point. This is the stage. These are the set pieces, and they would move along these grooves, and they would be pushed sometimes by hand or the pole and chariot, where they would, pull these, ropes to move the pieces back and forth. So there were two types of set designs for the Renaissance theater. Comic scenes exhibit private dwellings with balconies and views representing rows of windows after the manner of ordinary dwellings. So it looks like a standard city here. Your comedic ones had softer angles and were a little bit lighter, whereas your tragic scenes had more rigid edges and columns, pediments, statues that looked a little stiffer for tragedy. Here's more examples, and you can see how they work their way to the back. One of the Renaissance theaters is the Teatro Farnese, and pardon my Italian pronunciation, but you can see the beautiful seating areas, very similar to, your Greek theatron, but here we have it indoors and, separated definitely from a stage. Here you can see we have legs in our stage, but these look very similar to the legs that give the scenery depth. So Sebastiano Serlio, he has the wing set. And this allowed you to have these legs or these wings that give you depth and exits to the sides. And then you see another version here. And learning about set design and stages is a whole other unit. I mean, it's a whole other craft, which unfortunately used to be taught when we had the tech part of the academy. Now we don't really teach it because there's just so much that goes into learning everything about set construction and the history of how our stages are developed. And you can see this version with the set border at the top of the stage. So you can see how we are definitely influenced by this style. All right, that is it for today.